Hello there, welcome to the Yellow Submarine. Today, we would be talking about a man that helped shape the Beatles into the sensation they were. He is no other person than George Martin. Before we begin, please do well to hit the subscribe button and put on your post notifications bell. After George Martin died at age 90 on March 8, 2016, the music press greeted the news of his passing with familiar praise for his class and erudition, as well as for his place as rock's most vaunted and groundbreaking producer. While these aspects of his biography are generally beyond reproach, Martin's life and work were more complex than the deluge of celebrity hagiography in the wake of his death may have suggested. In spite of his posh-sounding accent, Martin had far more in common with the Beatles' working-class origins than they could have possibly imagined when they first came into his orbit at EMI's Abbey Road studios in June 1962. Martin was born on January 3, 1926, into a North London household without the benefit of electricity or running water. As the Great Depression exerted its awful toll, Martin's father, Harry, worked sporadically as a craftsman carpenter, while his mother, Bertha, took odd jobs as a maid and a seamstress. The sound of music pierced young George's world at an early age, as he toyed with an old upright that the family had acquired via his uncle who worked at a piano factory. At the tender age of 8, he wrote his first composition, The Spider's Dance, after half a dozen lessons. His great moment of epiphany occurred several years later when his school played host to the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Under the direction of Sir Adrian Boult, the orchestra performed Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, and 15-year-old George fell under the music's spell. "I thought it was absolutely heavenly," he recalled. "I couldn't believe human beings made that sound." But even at that early moment, George found himself enraptured by the making of music as much as with its aesthetic beauty. "I could see these men in their monkey jackets scrapping away at pieces of gut with horsehair and blowing into funny instruments with bits of the cane on their ends. But the mechanical things I saw simply didn't relate to the dreamlike sound I heard. It was sheer magic, and I was completely enthralled." Not long afterward, Martin and his friends organized a dance called the Fortune Tellers. Before long, they developed a steady following and a standing musical repertoire. "We played the standards by Jerome Kern, Cole Porter, and so on. Things like The Way You Look Tonight," he later recalled. Quick steps were always the most popular, and we always ended with the Goodnight Waltz. But as with so many men of his day, Martin's ambitions began shifting toward the omnipresent military effort that galvanized the nation. With World War II in full swing, he joined the War Office's non-uniformed ranks before enlisting in the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. While Martin never saw combat, his training took him from the English coast to New York City and Trinidad and back again. Along the way, he began self-consciously to refine his North London accent with the posh tones of the gentleman officers whom he chose to emulate. After the war, he enrolled in the Guildhall School of Music and 3 years later landed a plum job as assistant A&R for EMI's Parlophone label. By the mid-1950s, he had salvaged the struggling label from the scrap heap after developing an eclectic stable of artists, including comedy acts like Peter Sellers and the Goons, with whom Martin recorded several strong-selling records. There is little doubt that his newly acquired cut-glass voice, in the words of Beatle historian Mark Lewison, played a role in his ascent in the class-conscious UK. A well-honed deference and gentlemanly nature that Martin occurred during his war years no doubt came in handy as he climbed the ranks at EMI and attempted to find his mettle as an A&R producer. In this way, he proved himself to be highly sophisticated in dealing with artists. He was truly the ultimate producer in the sense that he could make people feel relaxed by taking himself out of the equation and succeeding in getting the performance from virtually anyone. That was his genius. A great producer is like the greatest of film directors in that you cannot glimpse their imprint on the finished product. For his part, Martin remained largely invisible, having disappeared into the background of the act of creation. By the time that the Beatles entered his world in the summer of 1962, Martin had developed a keen ambition to work with a beat group, preferably one with hit-making potential. After his initial efforts to reshape the band in the image of the day, as John Lennon and the Beatles, or Paul McCartney and the Beatles, he could not quite decide which way to go. He soon began to afford them the artistic space to chart their creative destiny, an unusual move in a recording industry that frequently treated pop stars and musicians like so many chatels. As Martin later reflected on his time with the Beatles, a two-way swing developed in our relationship. On one hand, as the style emerged and the recording techniques developed, so my control over what the finished product sounded like increased. Yet at the same time, my need for changing the pure music became less and less. As I could see their talent growing, I could recognize that an idea coming from them was better than an idea coming from me, though it would still be up to me to decide which was the better approach. In a sense, I made a sort of tactical withdrawal, recognizing that theirs was the greater talent. But that is not to say that he did not leave his mark on their music, however subtle that imprint may have been. He frequently prompted the bandmates to revise their musical structure in key ways. Witness Can't Buy Me Love, which began, quite arrestingly, with the chorus at Martin's suggestion. And then there's A Hard Day's Night, which the producer launched into the stratosphere with his wind-up piano technique via his intricate duet with George Harrison during the song's solo. But for Martin, the turning point emerged during the June 1965 sessions for Yesterday, the most covered composition in the Lennon-McCartney songbook. It was on Yesterday, Martin later wrote, that we first used instruments or musicians other than the Beatles and myself. I had often played the piano where it was necessary, as on A Hard Day's Night. On Yesterday, the added ingredient was no more no less than a string quartet, and that, in the pop world of those days, was quite a step to take. It was with Yesterday that we started breaking out of the phase of using just 4 instruments and went into something more experimental, though our initial experiments were severely limited by the fairly crude tools at our disposal and had simply to be molded out of my recording experience. Martin and the Beatles' penchant for experimentation would take them on an incredible musical journey from Revolver, 1966, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, through The Beatles, The White Album, 1968, and Abbey Road, 1969, their incredible swan song. But for George's money, the Penny Lane, Between Strawberry Fields Forever single was the best record we ever made. With its crisp production and a rich sense of melody, the single had all the hallmarks of a George Martin production. On the one hand, it required a fair amount of studio trickery to pull off, especially Strawberry Fields Forever, which consisted of 2 parts with conflicting time and key signatures that George skillfully grafted together. On the other hand, the listener can scarcely ascertain the producer's fingerprints on the Penny Lane Between Strawberry Fields Forever single at all. The man known as the 5th Beatle was more than a musical genius, integral to the success of the biggest selling band in history, with more than 800 million records shifted, according to author Kenneth Womack's new book Sound Pictures. Martin was also a cool entrepreneur who responded robustly to a cash crisis over studio rentals and possible bankruptcy. At various times, he rejected multi-million bids for his company and an offer from his former employer, EMI, which wanted him to return to a higher salary job. Instead, Martin took an even larger risk, opening a new studio in the Caribbean. None of Martin's success would have been possible if it were not for his musical skill. He was the production wizard, the keeper of the Beatles' flame. A kid can play a Beatles song in 2018 and it's as fresh, crisp, crammed with as much fidelity as when it was first made, Womack says in an interview. Beatles manager Brian Epstein said that Martin is a hitmaker. He can hear it anywhere and he can make it happen. Womack says, Martin did not always have the magic touch. He came together with the Beatles and they did amazing things for 7 years, but they were better than the sum of their parts. Martin had as many hits as anybody, but in a weird way, that wasn't his talent. Martin broke away from EMI in the 1960s because his salary was at that time only £3,000 a year. About $4,000. That for a producer behind many chart-topping records. He hired out his services to artists, establishing Associated Independent Records, AIR, studios. It was a shrewd move. Many acts needed studio time and help, and Martin could select the best. After the success of the Beatles' album, Rubber Soul, Martin set up on his own as a freelance producer. The Beatles were his main meal ticket. Even so, with the next album Revolver, the quartet considered going to Memphis to use the production professionals there. Says Womack, Martin had to make sure that the sessions for the album weren't relocated across the Atlantic. In the first meeting to discuss the new record, John Lennon described his vision for the song Tomorrow Never Knows. Lennon requested, "Make me sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop." Martin didn't say, "Wow, that's crazy, let's not do that." He said, "Very interesting." Martin's encouragement of musical experimentation stretched the Fab Four beyond their early pop cuteness. Bob Dylan's first reaction to Tomorrow Never Knows was, "I get it, you're not trying to be cute anymore." Martin would do everything he could do to seem like the supportive older mentor figure, and that way he got their juices flowing. No request was too difficult or impossible. If they said they wanted to work over the holidays, that was just fine. Martin knew the Beatles were interested in working with other producers, so he kept potential rivals at arm's length. Says Womack, a great example in the Yellow Submarine session, when he had a meeting elsewhere, instead of letting the Beatles doodle around by themselves for that night, Martin sent his wife, Judy, to sit in the producer's chair. It worked because they had known her a long time. It was smart to have someone representing him. Even so, by the summer of 1968, there is a kind of inevitable recoil, and he is starting to be relegated to the sidelines. The Beatles wanted the genius credit for themselves. When Paul McCartney especially wanted to work with producer Glyn Johns on the Get Back project, Martin was in danger of being a persona non grata. Says Womack, he made it his business to become a good colleague with Glenn when he was mixing. He kept an eye on what was going on, flipped in and out of the sessions when they were at Twickenham and later at Apple Studios at Savile Row. When the equipment didn't work, he came to the rescue, getting 2 4-track mobile units brought over from Abbey Road. He famously scrambled musician Alan Parsons to do all that work. After the Get Back disaster, the Beatles begged the loyal Martin to come back for the final Abbey Road album. There were multiple reasons. He was always available, he had a work ethic, studio savviness, and people skills. On one occasion, he had to settle a monumental bust-up when Yoko Ono took digestive biscuits from George Harrison's store. The engineer, John Kurlander, told Womack the amazing thing was how Martin settled this. Within hours, they had put aside their differences and were recording the concluding guitar solos. He had a way of keeping things together. Martin spent the rest of his life earning back his place in the Beatles ecosystem. A long-lasting partnership, says Womack. He became their most important spokesman after the CDs were released in 1987. The wizard found his way back and showed that he can still do the magic. Martin had his setbacks, but refused to give in. When Air ran into trouble over high rents it was barely paying on its first Oxford Street base, he mulled offers for £2 million for the business and rejected them. Instead of starting his Montserrat studio, which was a great triumph and great tragedy, it was destroyed first by a hurricane and volcanic eruption. With another studio in North London, Martin resolutely carried on, even when he started to lose his hearing in his early 50s. Martin was a real people person who kept up his contacts, says Womack. In the 1970s, when Lennon was going into some pretty strange and dark places, he would say things like, "He was lucky to have found us." Despite his prickliness, Martin took care to visit Lennon and ask for his views of the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl album. Finally, John came close to apologizing, saying his nasty comments were blacked out in his mind. Martin, in theory, had his pick of acts to work with after the Beatles. Working with McCartney was smart for him in the early 1980s, and he had some success riding America's ship after they dipped a little in the early 1970s. He was the man called on when Princess Diana died. The last single Martin produced was the biggest selling of all time, Elton John's reworking of Candle in the Wind with new lyrics from Bernie Taupin. For all this, he did not always get it right, says Womack. He produced Kenny Rogers and Neil Sedaka on the wrong side of their successes, worked weirdly with Ultravox, and then there was the disaster of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band movie. Womack reveals that Martin's eldest son Gregory suggested that David Bowie was making overtures towards his father for the Let's Dance album. Martin simply did not take the bait. You can't get it right all the time, and that final aspect, in and of itself, defines the whole of Martin's work. As he well knew, the act of production should be invisible. It should be so effective and evocative that you do not even know the producer is somewhere there in the back of the recording, behind the curtain, bringing the whole effort into tantalizing technicolor and real life. For all of his accolades, a Phil Spector production is always inalienable by Spector. Whether it involves the Beatles or the Chiffons, the echo number is right there, front and center, reminding us who is standing behind the control board. But a George Martin production is both less and more. It is decidedly less because George's identity in the music is latent. He has guided the artist to the moment in which the art comes to fruition without noise or fanfare. But it is also more because he can facilitate the release of the magical germ inside the artist's head over and over. So much so that Martin's skill as a producer emerged as a kind of fifth instrument for the Beatles. It was always there for the playing, for making the track brighter and, more often than not, better. And with George Martin and the Beatles, brighter and better usually translated into a new classic for the ages. We're glad you made it to the end of the video. See you next time, guys.